Hey Seekers, I'm Nick. At CES, AMD announced another GPU built on the RDNA architecture, the Radeon RX 5600 XT. The 5600 XT touts itself as being the card for the ultimate 1080p gaming experience at a reasonable price. So let's keep this video as short and as sweet as possible and see if the 5600 XT does what it was designed to do. The Radeon RX 5600 XT is coming in a single 6GB variant. Obviously there'll be a slew of partner cards as well as various different designs and different coolers, some of which we have already, but yeah, we're only allowed to show the Sapphire Pulse version in this video as instructed by AMD. Spec-wise, the RX 5600 XT is based on the Navi 10 GPU with the 7nm manufacturing process. It features 36 compute units, 2,304 stream processors with an initial boost clock of 1,560 MHz, which is now, as of 2 days ago, been boosted with a BIOS update up to 1,750 MHz. Now, we only tested this card in the OC mode because you can switch between the silent mode, but yeah, we didn't have enough time to test in the silent mode, so OC mode all the way. And as usual, we're using our GPU test system, which is running the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Ultra with the i7-8700K and 16 gigs of Team Group Dark Z at 3600 MHz. Now, we've also included some other cards that we've recently tested to give the Sapphire Pulse 5600 XT a little bit of context. Now, we don't include 1% highs or lows with this test because it just introduces way more extra testing, and I feel that when we get an average frame rate, it gives you guys a good indication of the expected performance anyways. And also, we did a little bit of Linux benchmarking. These are going to be called preliminary benchmarks because we didn't have proper drivers, AMD didn't have them. Also, there's a few kernel compatibility issues, and I kind of had to do a hack job and hack drivers together to make it work, and not everything works, so I suspect the numbers aren't going to be very accurate, but I wanted to include them just so you can get a kind of idea of what it's like in Linux. And also we spent a lot of time collecting the data and preparing this hack job Linux install for these tests. Now, we use all of these benchmarks for every single GPU benchmarking video, so you can go to any video that we've done and compare this GPU to anything else we've done. We've also started adding some extra tests as well because everyone's been asking us to do a couple more, so we did. And yeah, we like to use testing that's repeatable and standardized, and we don't like direct gameplay testing because those results, they just can't be repeated and there's just too many variables, and we just want the only variable to be the GPU and not a section of gameplay on a certain game or a certain map that no one plays. And yeah, I know people don't like that all the way that we test it, but too bad. That's how we're doing it, and that's how we're always going to do it, and it's accurate and repeatable. And with that said, let's start off with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now, we were only going to show the Windows benchmarks in this video because we couldn't actually get Tomb Raider to run in Linux with this card because of, as mentioned before, that kernel combo and the driver combo. And yeah, trust me, Linux guys, it doesn't work properly for now. So with that said, let's see what happens. For the 1080p benchmark, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 110 frames per second. For the 1440p test, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 75 frames per second. For the 4K test, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 40 frames per second. Now, I decided to do something because I'm crazy and I have two 5600 XTs, and I decided to test something that I don't think many people even think is supported. I tested Crossfire because Crossfire is actually supported with the 5600 XT. So yeah, let's run those Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmarks again, but this time, let's do it with two GPUs. For the 1080p test, we saw the 5600 XTs in Crossfire get an average score of 140 frames per second. For the 1440p test, we saw the 5600 XTs in Crossfire get an average score of 116 frames per second. For the 4K test, we saw the 5600 XTs in Crossfire get an average score of 67 frames per second. yeah, I was better than I thought it was gonna work. And yeah, I only did this purely because I can, and there's no reason to buy 2 of these cards in a real world situation, given just how unsupported Crossfire is with almost all games. However, the scaling with Shadow of the Tomb Raider is pretty good at 1440p and 4K. It's a lot better than I thought it was gonna be, and I'm surprised it even worked at all. Okay, let's move on to Unigine Superposition. For the Superposition test, we performed 3 tests in total. We used the 4K optimized preset, the 1080p extreme preset, and a custom 1440p preset with depth of field and motion blur disabled. Now, as usual, the Linux OpenGL version does not perform anywhere near as good as the Windows DirectX version, but yeah, we're gonna show you the comparisons anyway. For the 1440p custom test in Windows, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 96 frames per second. For the 1440p custom test in Linux, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 60 frames per second. For the 4K optimized test in Windows, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 45 frames per second. For the 4K optimized test in Linux, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 29 frames per second. For the 1080p extreme test in Windows, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 31 frames per second. For the 1080p extreme test in Linux, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 22 frames per second. Next up is Basemark GPU. Now, Basemark gives us a great indication of Vulkan performance since the 3D engine it uses has been designed with the low-level Vulkan API, and it really takes advantage of your 3D hardware. Now, we're slowly building our Windows Basemark database at the moment as well, so from now on, we're actually going to have some of those results in here too. So yeah, let's see how it all performed with the high preset. For the 1080p test in Windows, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 126 frames per second. For the 1080p test in Linux, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 113 frames per second. For the 1440p test in Windows, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 98 frames per second. For the 1440p test in Linux, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 87 frames per second. For the 4K test in Windows, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 59 frames per second. And for the 4K test in Linux, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 53 frames per second. Next up is the Final Fantasy 15 benchmarking tool. Now we're beginning to phase this out as we get more GPUs coming through, and we're going to retire this in the next few months, but for now, because we've got so much data, we're going to use it. For the 1080p test, we saw the 5600 XT render a total amount of 8,539 frames. For the 1440p test, we saw the 5600 XT render a total amount of 6,055 frames. For the 4K test, we saw the 5600 XT render a total amount of 3,331 frames. Lastly, we ran a new benchmark, the For Honor in-game benchmark. Now, For Honor gives us quite a few metrics, but we're only going to go with the overall average frame rate recorded, and all these tests were done with the Extreme preset. For the 1080p test, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 136 frames per second. For the 1440p test, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 75 frames per second. For the 4K test, we saw the 5600 XT get an average score of 45 frames per second. Now, we didn't do any overclocking with this card because our sample only arrived about 12 hours before this video went live, so there just wasn't enough time. Now, we did record some thermals for those who are interested. We let the GPU idle with the automatic fan curve for 1 hour, and we recorded the GPU temperatures and the memory junction temperatures as well. And then we slammed the GPU with Filmmaker for an hour and recorded those thermals as well. At idle, we saw the GPU average at 30.3 degrees, and at the memory junction, the average temperature was 31.6 degrees. At full load, we saw the GPU average at 58.2 degrees, and the memory junction average at 63.7 degrees. Now, as I mentioned, there just wasn't enough time to do acoustic testing, but from our observations, the Sapphire pulse in OC mode idles quite loudly and it ramps up to a pretty audible level, and there was 0 call whine as well, which is quite nice. Now, performance-wise, it slots in between, I'm gonna say, the GTX 1660 Super and the RX 5700, but in a bit of a weird pricing bracket. From our testing, it's a fair bit faster than the 1660 Super, which, to be honest, I was actually a little bit surprised at. The price AMD provided to us was US pricing only, so yeah, the Sapphire Pulse 5600 XT is priced at around 279 USD. Price-wise, the 5600 XT on average is about 12% more expensive than the 1660 Super, but at the same time, it's about 15 to 20% faster. Personally, paying those few extra dollars for performance uplift like that, I think it's going to be worth it. But again, that's still up for debate. It's still really early days with the 5600 XT. So yeah, I guess we'll just have to see how competitive it really is. And I would probably just wait for the other AIBs to start releasing cards too. The thing is with the 5600 XT though, I thought it was going to be something that was a bit meh. But yeah, it turns out that with the BIOS update that AMD provided for the Sapphire card, it's actually a pretty decent card for the money, and I reckon it does what AMD is claiming it does, being like primarily focused at high-end 1080p gaming. But in the same breath, I think it's actually going to be pretty decent for 1440p as well. And yeah, I'm just basing this really around the improved performance post that BIOS update that AMD ended up sending through. And I think at first with CES and with all those numbers that AMD showed, I think they were a little bit conservative. And yeah, when we compare it to the actual results post that BIOS update, it really does make the card a little bit more compelling. And to be fair as well, you could overclock the card to those numbers and get the same results, but having it out of the box as intended, basically, I think it actually does make it more compelling. Now, everything I'm saying is still based on that US pricing, so it could actually vary in your region, but I suspect it's going to be a similar story provided that you update the BIOS. Or yeah, I think Sapphire is probably going to have the BIOS updated out of the box like shortly with the later cards anyway, so I don't think it's going to be much of an issue. To be honest, I'm not going to recommend this card or not recommend it because I suspect the 5600 XT was potentially rushed to market to fill in a gap that the 5500 XT created, and I actually think we could do without the 5500 XT, because if we look at the difference between the two cards in price to performance, although the 5600 XT costs like 27% more than the 5500 XT, it performs on average around 44% better. So it still makes it more compelling. At the end of the day, you know, all we're doing is giving you numbers, you know, and these are the numbers that we found. It's up to you to make the decision on whether it's something you're interested in, or if it's something you're not interested in, or if it's something that's worth your hard-earned money. Simple as that. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. If you didn't like this video, you know what to do, and tell us what you hated about it. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. I'm your boy Nick with Gear Seekers. You peek, we seek. And Crossfire with the 5600 XT, Claire.
Oh yeah.
How good were those results? That's like 2080 Ti levels. Crazy. Thanks for watching.